All right, welcome. Hi, everyone. Um, Please be sure to check in. Welcome to session 5 of our Tribal Entrepreneurial Development Program. And are you able to see the slides? Maggie, are you seeing my slides?
Yes,
Okay.
but I had to, seeing them, I had to go get the link for this check-in.
Okay. All right, everybody. All right, so we have got a really exciting guest speaker with us today. So Peyton Batliner is the acting director for the Indian Energy Service Center, and he is going to be talking to us about tribal entity formation and some really great special things to know. So he specializes in business planning, financial analysis, and tribal utility formation. He holds an MBA with an emphasis in finance and entrepreneurship from the University of Colorado at Boulder. And so I just want to make sure you guys have a chance to check in. So I'll give you a second, and then Maggie's going to put, great. And our second guest speaker is also here. He joined early. Um, so Maggie's going to put that into the chat. And then Peyton, if you want to go ahead and share your slides, I'll stop sharing.
Sure thing. All right.
Hey, JD.
Hey. Good.
We're going to get started first with Peyton, and then you can talk right after him. That would be great.
Okay, great. Sounds good.
Awesome. And then Peyton, we can see your presentation mode again.
Oh, there we go. Let me change that again. 1 second. Swap presenter and all right. How's that looking now? Is that better?
Not
I
yet.
No?
think it's the same.
All right, 1 second. Let's see. Did that work? No. Seems not to like it now. 1 second. We'll get this figured out. Hold on. Here we go. Is that better?
Yes.
Looks great.
Okay. All right, perfect. So thanks for that brief introduction. So I'm Peyton Batliner. I'm currently the acting director of the Indian Energy Service Center. I've been basically detailed away from my typical position, which is the branch chief of business services at the Division of Energy and Mineral Development. And I worked there for about 14 years, where I advised tribes on business structures and utility development in the energy and mineral space. So really worked hand in hand with tribes on a technical assistance capacity. And I also gave away a lot of grant dollars. So we did a ton of feasibility studies, and now I have been moved into another world. It's more regulatory based. So I don't get to talk business structure and business startup activities as much anymore as I would like to. So thank you for inviting me here to speak today so that I can actually talk about the things that I'm really interested in. I started a business exactly in a program like this one. When I was getting my MBA, I took a startup execution course. It was the last semester, and we all had to come ready with a case study. I had no idea what to bring. So I was talking to my family, and my father, he's a dentist, and he had never owned his own dental practice. So he said, why don't you use owning and operating a dental practice as a case study? So I brought that to our startup execution course, and I was looking at, all the sessions that you guys are going through, and we did almost exactly this, went through all the feasibility planning, market analysis, entity formation. In dentistry, it's very unique because you need a licensed dentist to own patient records. So we had some really interesting entity formation activities around our business back then. And in 2010, actually purchased a dental practice, and then purchased 4 more, and then ended up selling them in 2019 to a private equity backed buyer. So gone through the whole process, and also through running the business, which had about 32 employees and 8 doctors. So that was an adventure, and I really enjoyed it. And hopefully I can share a little bit of that information with you all today. So in the tribal space, for business development. It's very unique. And I'm not sure how many attendees here are planning to fully own and operate their business entities on tribal lands. But that is a very unique and very different business structure than is typical in the state law business realm. So I'm going to give you just a real high level overview here of typically what I deal with, or I dealt with before being detailed away when I advise tribes on business startup. So just very high level. And JD, I hope, as an attorney, you can come in and potentially correct me on anything that I get wrong here. But I'm going to keep it very high level and try to take some of the jargon out of the business structure, just give a real high level overview of the playing field here. So typically you can form a business under tribal law, state law, or even federal law. And I have all of those entity types laid out here. There's a lot of detail that can go into these, but for tribes that are starting businesses and are either wholly owned businesses or businesses that they're engaged in outside participation, they can form under tribal law. They can form tribal instrumentalities or political subdivisions. Those are where you see the typical tribal programs, right, that are underneath the government structure and government authority. They're typically formed by resolution of the tribal council, right? Or you can have a tribally chartered corporation, nonprofit, or LLC that's formed under tribal corporations or LLC codes. And what's really important to understand about that is if you are actually going to participate in that sort of business structure, the tribe, the government entity that you're forming that on has to have already adopted this critical legal infrastructure. So the tribal council would have to have already adopted their corporations code, LLC codes. Oftentimes we talk about uniform commercial codes, UCCs, and lien filing systems. If your tribe does not have that in place, it's not a total barrier. It just doesn't mean that you can't form under tribal law as an entrepreneur. Okay, so just be aware of that. Generally, you can ask the secretary of the tribe if they have LLC codes or corporations codes in place. And if you can actually form business entities under those, they should be aware of that. If they have no idea what you're talking about, then we're talking, okay, state law is what we're going to default to next. Okay, so under state law, that is the very typical business entity formation activities that you hear of in every business course typically, right? So you're going to have a state law corporation, nonprofit corporation, LLC, sole proprietorship, partnerships, general partnerships, right? All of those can be formed under state law. Some of them are formalized legal entities, and some of them are not necessarily full and distinct from you as an individual, like a sole proprietorship or a general partnership would be. Okay. And I might let JD talk about some of the liability issues that may come up. But I'll talk more just from a business standpoint of why you would want to select one over the other. And then finally, under federal law. So with tribal governments, when I'm advising them in energy development activities, they have very unique business structures that they can utilize. Section 17 corporations, they can also form underneath their own tribal codes, their own corporations for holding entities to develop, these large scale energy projects. And also under the Energy Policy Act, there's a very unique business entity structure called a TEDO, or a Tribal Energy Development Organization. And there's only one of those in existence. And if you're not the Red Lake tribe, I know you haven't formed one, but if you're interested in looking into that, you can come and talk to me. Section 17 corporations, like I said, are federally chartered entities. You can only dissolve a Section 17 corporation by an act of Congress. So these are very strict, very rigid entity structures. So if anybody's interested in forming one of those, again, please reach out to me. So what are the common uses for these different types of business structures? Well, like I said at the beginning here, tribal instrumentalities and political subdivisions, those are typically your tribal government programming, utility districts, utility authorities, things that, the tribal government is engaged in operating and managing. tribally chartered corporations under tribal code. It could be, like I just said, a tribal development corporation. There are a lot out there in existence, and some of them are very large corporations like Ho Chunk Inc., if you've heard of them. Very unique business structure that tribes are able to utilize. But you can also form under tribal code. Nonprofits and individual entrepreneurs can conduct business activities utilizing corporation codes and LLC codes from tribes, just like they would with states. States are the most familiar, most common. We've all heard about them. If you go to the Nevada Secretary of State website, which I actually have a screenshot coming up, this is what we're talking about, right? So all your standard business entities can be formed under state law. Corporations, you typically hear Delaware Corporation. Unless you're at a significant scale, you might not look into that. But I see that, you know, one of the goals of this forum is to found a venture capable, that which typically means going out and raising some venture capital. You may be talking about corporate formation, corporate structuring, shareholders, and raising capital in that way if you actually go to a venture model. So I'll touch a little bit on that later. And then finally, Section 17 corporations, those are holding entities for tribes, wholly owned entities. You cannot have outside shareholders. The tribal council seats are often actually the shareholders of that company. You cannot have outside investment in a Section 17. So very structured and rigid business structure there that unless you're a tribal government, you're likely not to run into. So how do you actually form some of these business entities? Well, Nevada Secretary of State website has a great little section here. They have a new business checklist, and I'm actually in Colorado, and I've done this in Colorado a few times, obviously. And we now have a new business checklist as well on our website, which didn't exist 14 years ago when I founded my first business. So a handy little resource there. I would, invite everybody to just go poke around on that website. It walks you through quite literally all the steps that you need to go through to charter an LLC. I brought an LLC up because that's the most common business entity type for people who actually want to form a distinct legal entity. It's actually kind of pricey in Nevada, $540 to actually form an LLC. In Colorado, it's $75. So just, be aware that upfront there are filing fees and costs to starting these entities and registering them with your state. You'll need to fill out an articles of organization. That's the founding documents of an LLC. Oftentimes you'll also fill out an operating agreement to outline how that business entity actually operates as well. For a corporation, it's articles of incorporation. So these documents are a little bit different depending on the entity type that you select, but this website will walk you right through filling those out and filing those with the state, if that's what you choose to do. If your tribe does have business codes, they should have something like this as well. It may be paper-based and not online. I think I only know of a couple tribes that have online business registries. So just be aware of that you might have to physically go to the secretary of the tribe's office to fill out this paperwork. Another thing that I recommend everybody to do when you're thinking about your business, what are you going to call it, right? Through that checklist on the Nevada state, it's going to run you through a business and trademark search, right? The name of your business, is it already in use? Is somebody already using that? Also go to the USPTO, US Patent and Trademark Office, and search nationally if your business name that you want to use is being used currently. It'll give you a page. I took a screenshot right here. It'll tell you who's using that and where it's registered already. We ran into that issue. We registered in the state of Colorado. We did not register nationally for Sage Dental Care. It's the first one that came up here. And just a few months later, somebody in Florida registered Sage Dental Care nationally, and we had an issue. So avoid the issue that we ran into. If you, have any questions, patent and trademark, law is a huge field. There are a lot of people out there who can advise you in how to actually register your trademarks and patents and make sure that you're fully protected as you're going through this business formation stage. It's so important to make sure that you have this right from the beginning, right? So that you don't run into significant problems down the line. And I know from experience. So just make sure state and national, check both, okay? So what are the key considerations when you're thinking about starting a business? Number one, taxes, taxes, taxes. They are generally what you think about when you're starting your business. How is it going to be taxed? Why do I want to choose an LLC if I'm a small startup business over a corporation? If you're going to learn anything, learn pass-through taxation and double taxation. Corporations have double taxation, right? So the corporation is actually going to be required to file a tax return at the end of the year. Right now, the rates change every couple of years depending on administrations, but right now that rate is 21% corporate income tax. If you take money out of that business in the form of a dividend, right, you're also going to pay income tax on that as well, or capital gains tax. It really just depends how it's structured, but you will be taxed twice on that business entity. So that's why a lot of people typically, when they're starting up a business, default to an LLC. And it's just a more simple business structure that has pass-through taxation. That means that at the end of the year, the LLC does not actually file a tax return. You, as the member, so owners of LLCs are called members, not shareholders or owners. They're called members of the LLC. You file your income tax, what you made from that LLC, on your personal income tax, and you're taxed at that rate. That means the business passes through that tax liability to you as an individual. So just keep that in mind as you're looking at your business structures. Pass-through taxation versus double taxation. Unless you're, a pretty large scale business, or you have some really interesting business plans, you likely are not going to go through, and you need to raise money in a very direct and unique way. You likely won't utilize the corporate structure. Financing the business. So I talked about raising money. I have a saying I always say in these: he who holds the gold often makes the rules, right? So when you're putting together your business structure, who are you going to take money from? If you're going after a grant, if it's a state grant, a federal grant, a foundation, these are free money grants oftentimes, right? Or maybe have some sort of matching requirements. Those state, federal, foundation entities may require you to be chartered in that state. They may require you to be a nonprofit corporation or an LLC or for-profit corporation. It really just depends on the eligibility basis of those grants. I would invite everybody to look online and do a search for what free money is available for your business that you're thinking about starting up. You may be surprised what's available out there. There may be money for feasibility studies or business structuring courses, or who knows what's out there, right? So I just invite everybody to take a look, see what free money is available. Commercial debt. So most entrepreneurs typically, they go down to the corner bank and they sit in there with a business development loan officer at the bank, right? And they're going to require you on their banking application to have a business entity type selected. Are you a sole proprietorship, general partnership? Are you an LLC? Are you a corporation? Put that name down on my loan application, and you got to have a tax identification number, employer identification number. So you better make sure that you have your entity type selected and that the banking partners that you're working with are familiar with it and would lend to that entity type. And let me tell you, when I'm doing work with tribes, they run into this issue all the time. Their finance partners oftentimes don't know what a Section 17 corporation is. What are you talking about? Why would I lend to this entity type? You have sovereign immunity. What are your sue and be sued clauses within your entity type? So it's really important to know that whoever you're going to be asking for money from, that they are familiar with your business structure. There are some very good banks that work with tribal partners, tribal entrepreneurs, that they know all of this stuff, right? They know that you may be able to retain some sovereign immunity if you're only doing business on tribal lands, right? That's something that some banks may not be familiar with, but others are. So just be aware of that when you're in the commercial banking sector. Loan guarantees, those are federal programs that actually come in and back up the loans that banks will make to individual entrepreneurs. You can actually get a loan guarantee for up to 90% in one of our programs in BIA. If you are in a business which you might be having a little bit of trouble raising debt financing, I would invite you to look into what loan guarantee programs are out there that are available for your business type. You may be surprised that there is a guarantee program out there that would back up the lender giving you money and may ease up some of that money and make it available to you. And then finally, in the world that I work in a lot, tax incentives. Before we just had a big change in legislation, these big energy projects that tribes were engaged in, they lived and died by tax incentives. So also real estate deals, they live and die by tax incentives. But there's also another type of tax incentive called the new market tax credit, which can help with some real estate and some commercial operations. But the structuring of these businesses gets complicated, and they will, if you're taking money and you're inviting tax equity partners or new market tax credit partners, just be ready to have attorneys and CPAs involved in the structuring of your business, because in order to leverage those incentives, you need to do some in-depth financial work and make sure that the project remains eligible for the life of the tax credit and the incentive. And there's a lot of tax credits out there. And I put a link in here just to show you exactly what's out there for businesses that are engaged in this type of financing activity. Ownership, something that I think everybody here is interested in, right? Are you going to 100% own your business, or are you going to take money from somebody else, right? We call it the 3 Fs: friends, family, and fools, right? Are you going to take anybody's money? If you are, you better know what their expectations are. Are they going to want a piece of equity or ownership in your business? If so, how is that structured in your organizational documents, in your operating agreement, if you're an LLC? So you need to make sure that everybody has a very clear on paper understanding of what they are getting out of an investment in your company, okay? Third-party equity investors, these are the large, sophisticated investors, accredited investors, institutions. We talked to venture capital, private equity. These are highly regulated people to take money from. So anytime you're approaching people and taking money from these people, just please be aware that these are regulated environments, and just be very cognizant about what you're engaging in when you're trying to raise money. The
Peyton,
last two here. Yeah, go ahead, Maggie.
sorry to interrupt, but there is a question in the chat.
Oh,
How
yeah,
long
please.
how long does it typically take to get an employer identification number?
Ooh, I haven't done it in a few years, but it's pretty quick, within a week.
Okay, so you make
JD, do
the
you know?
application
Yeah.
online and then you receive it in the mail, right?
Yes.
Yeah, you
JD?
can actually you apply online and you can actually get confirmation online, and it takes like less than half hour.
Ah, there you
Oh,
go.
cool.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Yeah, excellent. If you're going after grants, there's another identification, a UEI is what we call it, and that takes a little bit longer to get. So there's different business registrations that may take longer to get than a half hour. But it's great to know that you can get, you can charter your LLC and do all of that within an afternoon typically.
Yeah, just to be clear, I'm just talking about the EIN portion.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
So the last two I have here on the ownership model are workforce retention. If you're planning on giving people portions of your company as an incentive to work with you, please talk to somebody who knows how to structure that to make sure that you don't get in trouble down the line. I'm not an attorney. I do not advise people on these sorts of structures. So I would invite you to contact people who are, that's all they do. Okay. If that's something you're interested in doing. And then finally, tax equity. Like I said, if you are engaged in anything that's going to bring in a tax equity partner, you're going to have attorneys and CPAs working with you on the structure of your business to make sure that everything is accounted for. And then finally, what are some other considerations that you should have and when you're thinking about selecting your business entity type? What's the annual registration at my state or tribe or whatever it may be? What are the meeting requirements? If you're forming a corporation, you're required to have an annual meeting. You're required to have elected executives within that business structure. Just know what you're signing up for when you're chartering your business and your entity type. What are the licensing requirements or other paperwork requirements of your city, state, whatever it may be, where you're operating your business. Existing legal infrastructure. If you're planning to do all of your business on tribal lands, please have a good understanding of what's already in place there. And then this is more for tribes that are doing business, but how is that entity type going to fit within your organizational structure? That's really important for them to know. And taxation, again, if you're doing business on tribal lands and you're an individual on tribal lands, do you fill out a annual tax return? If you charter a business under state law, you'll likely have to pay taxes, even if you're conducting some business activities on tribal land. So just be aware of what the requirements are for your area for taxation. It's absolutely critical. And then finally here, I didn't touch on liability at all, right? But JD, maybe you will. But there's an excellent chart here on the Small Business Administration's website that has every type of business structure from sole proprietorship to corporate structures that show you, hey, here's the ownership considerations, here's the liability considerations, and here are the tax implications for each of these types of business structures. And then I have a pro and con section, but maybe I'll just leave it to that for now. And we could, if people have questions, we can answer questions and whatnot. All right.
Great. Do we have any questions? And Peyton, would you be willing to share your contact information?
Yes, absolutely. The last slide, I'll share this whole presentation with everyone. And the last slide has my contact info on it.
Perfect. Thank you. And I'll be sending these slides out after today for anybody who wants it, as well as the recording. And so if you guys want to go ahead and put any questions you have into the chat, or feel free to unmute. Okay. Awesome. Peyton, thank you so much for your time. Really, really appreciate it. All right. Yeah, we really appreciate having you here. And I know it's such important information for everybody. Oh, we do have a question. Is there an extra form that goes to the IRS?
Don't understand the question.
Yeah.
If you're on an iPhone, though, you can unmute and just ask the question. Give us a little background.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, this is Lori. I was just calling because I was wondering, when you do your LLC, I was told that in 2024, that's an additional IRS form that needs to be filed about who your board members are. Because I did the EIN for the IRS, but I'm not sure about that extra form.
I can take it if you want. Yeah, so basically there's a new law called the Corporate Transparency Act that came into effect at the beginning of this year. And if you create a new entity, you have to file a statement of beneficial owners with it's not the IRS, it's actually like the Department of Treasury, basically, and you have to do it within 90 days of forming your entity.
Okay, so is there a link from the IRS or just go to departmentoftreasury.gov and then look for it there?
Yeah, you could. I would suggest you just basically search for Corporate Transparency Act filing,
Okay.
and there you'll either be able to find the direct to the government one, or there's some service providers out there that can help you with it for a fee.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You bet.
All right. Any other questions? Put that into the chat. Okay, everyone, thank you. Peyton, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. Okay, and next we are going to hear from JD. He is going to get into a little bit more of the details on some of those entities. So some quick background on JD. He is Macy and Peters Law. He represents entrepreneurs and high growth companies at all stages of their growth cycle, from formation to exit. He counsels clients on a wide range of corporate and commercial matters, including corporate structuring and governance, fundraising, employee equity, IP licensing, and commercial agreements, as well as mergers and acquisitions. Thank you for being here, JD.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you very much. I'm just trying to all right, I guess I'll share my screen here.
Perfect.
And then can y'all see this?
Yes. You want to put it in presentation mode?
Yeah, sure. Sometimes that works better than others, but okay.
All right, that looks great. Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, thanks, Kara. So yeah, my name's JD. I'm up in Reno, Nevada. I have a partner named Craig Macy. We have a small practice and mostly represent startup companies and entrepreneurs kind of at various stages of, kind of the business cycle, if you will. So what I'm going to talk about is a little bit about entity selection and formation. I'm going to be talking about purely from the state law corporate perspective. I'm not any sort of tribal law expert by any means, but this is all kind of the nuts and bolts of forming an entity, kind of regardless of your situation. Here's my boring legal disclaimer that none of this is legal advice. This is all just for informational purposes. All situations are unique, and you should always consult a lawyer of your own choice. A little bit about me. Like I said, I have a small law firm here in Reno. We represent startups mostly. I went to law school in Austin, Texas at the University of Texas, worked out there for a while, moved back to Reno in 2021, and that's when I started my own firm. Here's our agenda for the day. Why do I need an entity? We're talking a lot about what entities are and what their characteristics are. Why do I need one in the first place? What are the various types? Here they are. And then which one is best for you? So why do I need an entity? Kind of the headline of why you need an entity is if you don't have an entity, you subject yourself via your business actions to potentially unlimited personal liability. And so what that means is if you're out there doing business without an entity and something goes wrong, or you breach a contract, or you have some sort of large scale regulatory issue like a data breach or something like that, you could potentially be on the hook for not only the company's assets, but all of your personal assets as well. And so that's the main reason why having an entity is so important, is because it provides a layer of liability protection to the owners and to the directors and officers of the company. And so, the most common kind of form of an entity for someone that just says, hey, I have a business idea. I want to sell whatever widget I want to sell. I want to keep it simple. It's just going to be me, maybe a couple employees. Most people start an LLC, and, you form an LLC with the state. Peyton just kind of showed you how. And there's still a few things you need to make sure that you do in order to get that protection. And so one of them is, this is kind of the top one that I always say, is like, don't commingle funds, right? So if you're going to start an LLC, make sure you start a bank account with that. You get a bank account open for that LLC. Make sure that when you're operating your business, all the cash flows in and out of that bank account. If you want to make distributions to yourself personally to spend money individually, that's totally fine. But those need to go from your business bank account to your personal bank account, and then you make your personal expenditures. If you start making personal expenditures via your bank, via your entity, you run the risk of something called piercing the corporate veil. And what that means is that creditors can potentially get through your entity's limited liability protection and potentially have access to your own personal assets. So this to me is kind of the headline. Like if you take anything away from this, it's if you start an LLC, especially if it's just one person, right? So a lot of people think, hey, it's just me. What's the big deal? Who cares? It does matter in this circumstance of how you're spending that money, where it's coming from, so that you can track it and say, look, this is all business activity, and you can make a very clear record of the business activity. Another thing is to follow corporate formalities. So there tends to not be a lot of corporate formalities when it comes to like a single member LLC, but you still probably want to have some sort of simple operating agreement in place. It's a good idea to have like a annual meeting with yourself and draft up some minutes and say, I talked to myself about the business. It's a little bit silly, to be honest, but the general concept of following the corporate formalities is another way that you're able to kind of perfect those limited liability protections. And the final one is to properly capitalize the entity. So if you're doing business and you sign a contract and you say you're going to be able to provide tons of goods and services and things like that, but really the entity has no ability to do so, and it's all just kind of like a shell, there could be issues there. So it's important to kind of right size your capital contribution with respect to the business that you're operating, with respect to kind of what your potential liabilities are. So for example, if you sign a contract and you say you're going to pay someone $50,000, and you've only capitalized the business with $5,000, there's a potential that contractual partner is able to reach through the limited liability and say like, hey, this entity wasn't properly capitalized. And so it's important to kind of get that off the ground. I've been talking mostly in this context just about a single member LLC as opposed to a sole proprietorship. One of the things that's nice about a single member LLC is that you don't have to file a tax return for it. It's taxed as a disregarded entity, so you're able to get kind of the limited liability protection. There are the state fees, but there's not the additional complexity of having to file an entity level tax return. You can do it all on your own personal tax return. Okay, so that's the reason why. Okay, so entity types. Limited liability company, most common. You can either have a single member, which means one owner. This is basically like, hey, I want to start a business. I don't have any partners. I don't want any other owners. And the nice thing is no tax returns required. Or you can have a multi-member. And a multi-member means you have more than one owner. And so in the multi-member context, we'll talk more about this, but it's important to make sure you have an operating agreement that says kind of what the rights are with respect to the company, who owns it, who gets to make decisions on behalf of the company, things like that. Then there's a C corporation, which is like, if you think of the stock market, if you think of like Apple, those are all C corporations. They all have a board of directors, and then they have separate stockholders, and they have separate officers. C corporations are taxed twice is kind of the main difference. They're taxed at they're taxed once is probably a better way to put it. They're taxed at the entity level, and then distributions to the owners are taxed as well, which can be a downside, or as we'll talk about in a minute, there's some potential offsets that make it a pretty enticing structure in certain situations. S corporations are kind of a hybrid of the two. They're more like a limited liability company than a C corporation. They don't have double taxation. The entity is not taxed. Everything is passed through. But there are a lot of restrictions on S corporations. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And then there's a concept of a limited partnership. These aren't really great entities for operating businesses. They tend to be more for like investment vehicles. If you're creating like a fund to invest in other companies, things like that. But what's important is kind of regardless of what you're using it for, if you have a limited partnership, you're able to get that limited liability protection, where if you have something called a general partnership, it's very similar to a sole proprietorship. but with more than one person, and you have no limited liability protection. So you want to avoid a general partnership. Okay, let's talk about a limited liability company. So there's kind of the main thing about a limited liability company is there's lots of flexibility with them. There's not a lot of default rules like there are for corporations. And so it allows you to kind of structure your internal ownership and governance however you want, which can be a good thing. It can also be a bad thing because it means you basically have to write everything down because there's no default rules. So it takes some thoughtful work on the front side of, who are the owners, what are their rights, how are you going to distribute money, who gets to make the decisions about when you distribute money, what if you want to make major decisions for the company, who makes those decisions, are there certain thresholds of approval that need to be met, things like that. So the flexibility kind of goes both ways. As I mentioned, if you have more than one owner, you're going to want an operating agreement that basically says, who makes decisions, and how are profits and losses distributed. There's can be tricky issues sometimes if there's 50-50 ownership, if people are disagreeing about kind of a major decision. Hey, I want to sell the business. Hey, I don't want to sell the business. You can end up in a situation where there's a deadlock. And so it's important to kind of contemplate that as you're putting together your initial documents, because you don't want to end up in a situation where the deadlock creates just complete stagnation in the business. So you can put different mechanisms in there to allow like one person to buy the other person out, or you can get the business appraised, things like that. With respect to multi-member, they can be member managed or manager managed. I personally like manager managed. It's similar to a board of directors. In Nevada, what's nice about having a manager managed is when you're doing the Nevada filings, you only have to have the managers listed, whereas if it's member managed, you actually have to list all the owners of the company. And all that information is public. So you may want to go the manager managed route just for kind of like information privacy purposes. Tax status. So LLCs that are single members are disregarded entities. So they don't have to file their own tax return. Everything flows through directly to the owner, which is the case for multi-members as well. Multi-members, the default option is they're taxed as a partnership. So the difference is the entity still has to do a tax return and issue K-1s to all the owners, but the actual profits and losses flow through to the owners, and are taxed on the owner's individual tax returns. One interesting thing about LLCs is they can elect to be taxed as a C corporation or an S corporation. So again, that flexibility is a lot with an LLC. I tend to think if you're going to be a C corporation, you might as well just have stock in the board of directors and things like that. But sometimes you'll see this mostly in like the private equity context where they want a more complex waterfall, but still want to be taxed as a C corporation. Okay, C corporations. So C corporations have kind of like three general levels. They have the stockholders who own the company. Again, like think of Apple, you buy shares on the stock exchange, you're an owner of that company, right? Like you have a right to the future cash flows of that company. Then there's the board of directors. The board of directors is kind of where the buck stops in terms of decision making for the company. And so they owe fiduciary duties to the stockholders. They basically are required to act in the best interest of the stockholders and not their own personal interests. And they make the big high level decisions with respect to long-term strategy and a lot to do with like capitalization and mergers and acquisitions activity. And then there's the officers. So this was like the CEO, the CFO, all the way down. And they have kind of the day-to-day responsibilities for running the business. So in a lot of like companies that we work with, my firm works with, it'll be, a startup, a person has an idea, they form a corporation, and they basically wear all these hats at the same time. They can be the only stockholder, the only director, and the only officer for a period of time, or really indefinitely. But kind of the idea is they start out that way, and then they bring in more people, or they raise money and then they have more stockholders, or they, someone in the industry is really knowledgeable and helpful and they join the board of directors to provide guidance there, things like that. The main downside of a C corporation is that it's subject to entity level taxation. So what that means is if the entity has profits at the end of the year, that profit is taxed at the corporate tax rate, which I think is like, it's like 20% plus a few add-ons. It's like 23% total. The flip side of that is if the company has losses, you're able to kind of like accumulate those losses, and they can be helpful going forward, those NOLs and net operating losses, because you can offset future profits. So one thing that has to be mentioned in talking about C corporations is something called qualified small business stock. And you may have heard kind of the concept of like, startups or Silicon Valley style startups that want to be high growth technology companies are all C corps, and that VCs will only invest in C corps. The main reason, in my opinion, is something called qualified small business stock. And what this is a provision of the tax code that has the goal of incentivizing investment in early stage companies, both cash investment and for entrepreneurs to start businesses and use their time and efforts to do so. And what it allows, it's a pretty crazy windfall. And so if you form a corporation, there's about 6 check boxes that you have to meet this qualified small business stock, one of which is you have to be a C corporation, right? And that's why it's on the slides here. And if you hold those shares for 5 years and you meet the other requirements, on the sale of that stock, so if someone wants to buy your company and you do a stock sale, the owner of that stock is entitled to a complete tax exclusion equal to the greater of $10 million or 10 times your basis in the stock. So for most founders, what that means is if they sell their shares after 5 years of holding it and they meet all the requirements for qualified small business stock, they can get up to $10 million tax-free at the federal level. So it's a crazy windfall. And it basically is the tail wagging the dog on like why a lot of high growth technology companies are C corps, is because one, they don't really have a lot of profits. Most of the time they run at a loss, which is why they have to go raise capital. And two, they're able to potentially take advantage of this just total windfall scenario from a tax perspective. Corporations have a lot more default rules than LLCs, which can be a bad thing, but honestly, in a lot of cases, it's a good thing because it just simplifies your initial structuring. You're able to just issue shares. Everyone kind of knows the rules. The board of directors runs the show, and you go from there. And this last point relates very directly to the qualified small business stock point, is that most companies that are seeking investment are C corps, and that's because the investors want to have the opportunity to take advantage of that qualified small business stock. Okay, S corporations. So S corporations are kind of a hybrid of an LLC and a C corporation. They have pass-through tax treatment, which is very similar to an LLC or a partnership. There's also an ability for owners to avoid FICA taxes after a quote reasonable salary threshold is met. So it depends a little bit on what your industry is and what the reasonable salary for your work is in the area that you're in. But this can be a pretty solid tool for people because you're able to basically avoid payroll taxes after you meet that reasonable salary. So for example, if whatever industry you're in, if kind of the reasonable salary is $100,000 and you have profits of $200,000 that year, you're able to avoid FICA taxes on that second $100,000. So it can be pretty useful. Accountants love S corps for like a variety of reasons, including the one that I just said. So, if you're talking to accountants, they'll almost certainly suggest you be an S corp. I don't love them as much, and that's because there's lots of restrictions. And so, like, for example, there can only be one class of stock. You can't have any entity owners, which makes it very hard to raise money. So you couldn't have like any sort of other entity, like a limited partnership, which is the structure of most venture capital firms. They couldn't be an owner. You can't have any foreign owners. You can only have 100 shareholders, no more than that, and it's not eligible for QSBS. So it's a really good structure in the right circumstances. But if you're not, if you kind of have a vision of, not necessarily making profits, putting every dollar that the company makes back into the company and going kind of the high growth strategy, it's really not a great entity selection because of all the restrictions. And it can be very challenging to move from an S corporation to a C corporation and get the QSBS. It's pretty easy to turn from an S corp to a C corp, but you're not going to be able to get the QSBS treatment unless you do kind of some complex structuring. Okay, and then the question, we've been through kind of the main entity types. What entity is best for me? And I always start this conversation with questions. So what are your goals, right? Like what are your goals for this company? Is it to be, kind of a high growth software company that, is not planning to make profits anytime soon and really make all your money on selling the business down the road? Do you want to sell the business? Do you want to run it as a business that is a really successful kind of cash cow? Tends to be the phrase of, hey, we sell X, people buy it, we don't have to raise money, it's a really good product, we make a bunch of cash. And if that's the case, you probably don't want to be subject to the double taxation. It kind of comes down to, are you going to be making frequent and potentially large distributions to the owners on an ongoing basis, on a yearly basis? Or are you planning to reinvest almost all that capital back into the business in a way where, your goal is to grow the business and sell it at a multiple, in which case, that qualified small business stock treatment is so valuable. So that's kind of the first question, is like, what are your goals? And then, like I just mentioned, like, what is the cash flow situation, right? Like, is there going to be a lot of profits on an annual basis, or is this the kind of thing that's going to take a lot of capital investment and a lot of time to start seeing that cash flow? Because that can inform your decision about whether being taxed at the entity level matters. If you're not making profits, it can actually be very valuable to be taxed at the entity level, because then you build up net operating losses that have value going forward. Whereas if you have a bunch of cash and it's coming out every year, maybe you want to avoid that being taxed at the entity level and just have it be taxed at the individual level as it passes through to the stockholder. Again, what are you going to do with the company profits? Are you going to reinvest them in the company? Or are you going to distribute them? Do you want to raise money? If you want to raise money, the C Corp's almost always the way to go because of the qualified small business stock. And then the question of, can I change entity types? And the answer to this is yes. And so one thing I tend to suggest to people is, if you're not sure what to do in terms of an entity type, if you form an LLC and you don't make it an S Corp, so it's either a disregarded entity or a partnership, you can change it to a C Corp relatively easily, as long as you don't have a bunch of debt in the company. And at that point, when you do that conversion, all those benefits of the C Corp that I mentioned with respect to qualified small business stock are available. And so a lot of times what I suggest is, hey, if you're just getting going, you're not really totally sure of your strategy, you're not really sure if you're going to raise money, any of those things, it can be a good idea to just say, all right, I'll just form an LLC, single member LLC, keep it really simple. And then as things progress, I can make the decision with respect to converting to a corporation or an S Corp or whatever. But if you want to, it's a lot more difficult. If you start with a C Corp, you say, oh, this is not great. I want to distribute cash all the time. It's basically a taxable event to go from a C Corp to an LLC. So you're going to have to deal with that at that time. Unless you have a bunch of debt, unless the LLC has a bunch of debt, there tends to be no taxable event on the switch from an LLC to a C Corp. So going one direction is much easier than going the other. So that's why I say, if you're not sure, start with the one where it's easier to change down the road. Plus you're not having kind of the double taxation at the beginning. So that's all I had for today. I don't know if there's questions, but I'm happy to answer them or, have a discussion on kind of any of these points. So let me know.
Well, people
Thank you,
feel free to
JD.
unmute. And
Yeah,
thank you, JD.
unmute. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, JD. Yeah, feel free to put things into the chat or unmute. And then we also have JD's email here too. We can put that into the chat also, Maggie.
Will do.
Hi.
We can hear you.
This is Lori. I was just wondering, do a lot of like say LLCs that maybe do consulting or whatnot, do you suggest that like here in Nevada that they get like a consultant insurance? Are those normal?
I'm not totally sure the specifics of consultant insurance. There's a lot of like errors and omissions policies out there that tend to be kind of like dependent on the specifics of your business. Like for example, my law firm, we have malpractice insurance. Doctors, same kind of thing. Consultants, it tends to be more of like an errors and omissions policy, but it's definitely worth looking into.
Anyone
Hello?
else?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, Chris.
So I had a question. I heard on the LLC or anything like that, you need like an agent to form one, or is that not?
So yeah, any entity type in any state is going to require a registered agent that's in that state. And the concept is basically the registered agent can be served with a lawsuit that's against the company on behalf of the company. If you're in the state that you form your entity in, so if you are in Nevada and you form a Nevada LLC, you can be your own registered agent. Just note that the address you provide is going to be public.
Any other questions?
Would people who are on this line on the meeting be able to reach out to you guys independently to get or seek further information or direction?
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
okay, sweet. So I know there's a couple in here that's Lori pointed out consultation, or there's even a person in here who's looking to form an LLC possibly for a group that would be acting on behalf of multiple people in Nevada that wouldn't necessarily be raising funds, but in order to just kind of keep capital to be able to say do workshops and provide travel and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'll share the presentation, and then I think Kara put my email in the chat as well. So feel free
Okay.
to reach out.
Thank you.
Okay, great.
Great.
So I just had one comment. So that when you go through the state of Nevada Silver Flume to do your LLC, and then you become the registered agent, you start getting lots of mail and phone calls from IT people, people that want to know more about registering your LLC nationally, and just so be aware that if you decide to become your own agent, that those calls just start flooding in.
Yeah, it's a good point. And a lot of times you'll even get mail that tries to look like it's official from the state, but is really from just kind of a scammy company. So you got to be careful with that stuff for sure.
Okay, great. Unless there are any other questions, JD, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. I have put up here on my screen the check-in QR code. So if you did not check in, please be sure to check in. Maggie has also put the link into chat. And then just so you are all aware, this is the schedule for the remainder of the program. So today was legal strategy and entity formation. And on Thursday, we are going to be getting into go-to-market and distribution. So hopefully we can all see you guys there on Thursday and we can continue the program. And thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you for coordinating those great presentations as well. So much information might be overwhelming. So I think as people digest more and look at their business, like you mentioned, ideation, they'll be able to be like, oh, this is where it fits. I have questions and can reach out as well. So thank you for that.
Of course. And the recording will also be available as well as the slides. So, lots of great resources for everyone. Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. Have a good
Thanks,
rest of your
JD.
day.
Bye-bye.
Okay, guys.
Thank you.